Warning, this video contains major spoilers for The Last of Us Episode 3. Episode 3 of The Last of Us tells the touching story of Frank and Bill, ending on a bittersweet note due to Frank's illness. Episode 3 of The Last of Us begins as you might expect, with Joel and Ellie recovering from Tessa's death and continuing on to Bill and Frank's small town. However, as the series shifted focus to Bill's experiences on Blast Day 2003, much of The Last of Us Episode 3 dealt with his relationship with Frank, making the biggest change from the original game to date. The story includes elements from the original game, mainly that Frank and Bill are a couple living in Lincoln. In the biggest game of The Last of Us, Episode 3 shows Frank and Bill's relationship from beginning to end. This ending is set up by Frank, who by the end of The Last of Us Season 3 has progressed and is suffering from a specific illness that forces him to plan his last romantic day with Bill. Frank suffers from Parkinson's disease in Episode 3 of The Last of Us. Based on how Frank acts after his illness in The Last of Us Episode 3, it's safe to say he has Parkinson's. Parkinson's disease is a disease that affects the brain by increasing damage to different areas of the brain over time. The main symptoms of Parkinson's disease that affects Frank in Episode 3 of The Last of Us are involuntary body tremors, slow movements, muscle stiffness, and insomnia. All of this is unfortunately highlighted in Bill and Frank's story in the second half of The Last of Us episode. In Episode 3 of The Last of Us, Frank talks about how his illness was incurable before the outbreak, meaning that going to the doctor still won't do him any good. It also shows that Frank suffers from Parkinson's disease, which is unfortunately incurable in the real world. The development of Parkinson's disease forces Frank to plan his last day with Bill, which they both experience before their tragic death. Frank's illness represents another danger in the post-pandemic world. Frank's illness in The Last of Us Episode 3 highlights another threat to the world in the 2023 cosmic timeline. While the main threat is obviously the infection and the Last of Us fungus that causes it, Cordyceps sinensis, the fall of humanity means there will be less care for those suffering from other ailments before the outbreak. While Frank and Bill are lucky in a way, the acquisition of a drug that could help Frank and Lincoln highlights something that was not addressed in the original game: how other diseases in the bleak post-apocalyptic world arguably pose a greater threat to the last survivors. New episodes of The Last of Us air every Sunday on HBO. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and support my channel.